The strange thing about grief is that it never arrives all at once. It comes in waves, quietly taking pieces of you until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who laughed so easily, or believed tomorrow was guaranteed. 5 years ago, I still believed life was simple. I believed promises lasted forever. And I believed that if two people loved each other enough, nothing in the world could separate them. Looking back now, I realize how innocent I was. My name is Claire Walker, and before life taught me otherwise, I was simply a wife hopelessly in love with a man named Ethan Walker. We met in the least romantic place imaginable, standing in line at a neighborhood grocery store in Asheville, North Carolina. I was balancing too many bags of fruit while answering a work email, and I dropped an entire carton of peaches across the floor. Everyone watched them roll away except one man who immediately knelt down, laughing as he chased every peach before it disappeared beneath the shelves. He handed me the last one with the biggest smile I had ever seen and said, "I think these peaches wanted to meet me first." It was such a ridiculous thing to say that I laughed harder than I had in months. That single moment changed the direction of my entire life. Ethan had a gift for making ordinary days unforgettable. He never needed expensive surprises or grand speeches. He could make a rainy afternoon feel like an adventure, simply because he was there. He loved old country roads, Sunday morning pancakes, handwritten notes hidden inside my purse, and dancing barefoot in our kitchen whenever our favorite songs came on. People often asked what made us so happy together, and I never had an answer that sounded impressive. We simply chose each other every single day. That became the foundation of our marriage. We had been married for almost 3 years when Ethan accepted the overseas engineering contract that changed everything. He specialized in structural restoration after natural disasters, and helping rebuild communities gave him a sense of purpose that I admired deeply, even when it meant spending months apart. When he first told me about the opportunity, I smiled because I wanted to support his dream, but inside I was terrified. Something about the assignment made my heart uneasy. Maybe it was the distance. Maybe it was the dangerous conditions. Maybe it was simply the fear every wife feels when the person she loves boards a plane headed somewhere she cannot follow. Ethan noticed the worry on my face before I said a word. He reached across our dining table, took both of my hands, and reminded me that fear should never be allowed to make our decisions for us. He promised the contract would only last 8 months. We would save enough money to finally buy the farmhouse we had been dreaming about. We would plant the apple trees we kept talking about, build a wraparound porch, and someday watch our children run through the yard while our old dog chased butterflies. He painted our future so vividly that I could almost see it. By the end of that conversation, I convinced myself 8 months would pass quickly. I kissed him goodbye at the airport, believing our hardest challenge would simply be missing each other. For the first several weeks, everything felt manageable. We talked every evening despite the time difference. Sometimes the internet connection froze halfway through our conversations, and we would laugh as each of us guessed what the other had been trying to say. Ethan showed me the mountains surrounding the worksite, introduced me through video calls to coworkers from different countries, and even complained about how much he missed real American coffee. Every call ended exactly the same way. He would press his wedding ring against the camera and say, "Count one less day until I'm home." I kept a calendar on our refrigerator and crossed off each passing day with a bright red marker. Every tiny square brought us closer together. Friends told me I was handling the separation better than they expected, but they never saw the nights I slept wearing Ethan's old sweatshirt because it still smelled like him. They never saw me reaching across an empty bed before remembering he wasn't there. Love has a way of turning even silence into company, and I learned to live with that silence because I believed it was temporary. Everything changed on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. I remember every detail because trauma has a cruel way of preserving moments you desperately wish you could forget. I was leaving work when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but I answered anyway. The voice on the other end introduced himself as someone from Ethan's company. His tone was careful, almost rehearsed. He asked if I was somewhere safe before continuing. Even before he explained what had happened, my knees felt weak. There had been a catastrophic structural collapse during a rescue operation following severe flooding. Several workers were trapped beneath thousands of tons of concrete and steel. Emergency teams searched for survivors for days. Ethan had been assigned to the section that suffered the greatest damage. His identification and personal belongings had been recovered, but despite every effort, his body had never been found. Local authorities concluded that the force of the collapse and the flooding made recovery impossible. I remember hearing those words without understanding them. Impossible. Presumed dead. No survivors. They sounded like someone else's nightmare. Surely they had made a mistake. Surely another man had borrowed Ethan's equipment. Surely my husband would call in a few hours to tell me everything was fine. I thanked the man on the phone before realizing I had absolutely no memory of ending the conversation. I simply stood beside my car staring into nothing, while the world continued moving around me as though nothing had happened. The days that followed disappeared into a blur of paperwork, phone calls, condolences, and unbearable silence. My parents flew in immediately. Ethan's older sister, Megan, practically moved into my house because she refused to let me spend a single night alone. Friends filled my refrigerator with meals I never ate. Flowers covered every available surface until the scent became overwhelming. People hugged me constantly, yet I had never felt more isolated. The hardest part wasn't accepting that Ethan was gone. The hardest part was accepting that there would never be a final goodbye. There was no last embrace. No last conversation. No chance to hold his hand one final time. Just unanswered questions that echoed louder every night. Weeks later, a memorial service was held because everyone agreed families needed closure, even without a body. I stood before an empty casket surrounded by photographs from happier days. There was one picture from our wedding where Ethan was looking at me instead of the camera, smiling with that familiar warmth that made me feel like the only person in the world. I remember touching the edge of that photograph before the service began and whispering, "You promised you'd come home." It wasn't anger I felt. It was heartbreak mixed with confusion, because somewhere deep inside me, a tiny voice refused to believe our story had ended that way. Months turned into years, and life slowly demanded that I keep living. I returned to work because the bills never stopped arriving. I forced myself to meet friends for dinner even when all I wanted was to stay home. I started volunteering at a local grief support center, partly to help others and partly because listening to their stories reminded me I wasn't the only person carrying invisible pain. Healing didn't happen all at once. It arrived in small victories. The first time I laughed without immediately feeling guilty. The first holiday I survived without crying myself to sleep. The first morning I woke up and realized Ethan hadn't been my very first thought. Every one of those moments filled me with relief and shame at the same time. I often wondered whether moving forward meant I was leaving him behind. Then one evening, an older widow at the support group looked me in the eyes and said something I have never forgotten. She told me that healing was not betrayal. She said love doesn't disappear simply because life keeps moving. Those words became the permission I didn't know I needed. I didn't stop loving Ethan. I simply learned how to carry that love differently. I believed that chapter of my life had finally come to a peaceful close. I had no idea that the greatest heartbreak of my life wasn't waiting behind me. It was quietly walking toward me, one impossible step at a time. If someone had told me during that first year after Ethan disappeared that I would one day fall in love again, I would have considered it an insult to everything we had shared. I wasn't angry at the idea because I believed loving someone else was wrong. I was angry because I couldn't imagine my heart ever having enough room to carry that kind of joy again. Every memory of Ethan still lived inside the walls of our little house. His favorite coffee mug remained in the cabinet exactly where he had left it. His old leather jacket still hung by the front door. Even after 5 years, I couldn't bring myself to donate it because every time I wrapped it around my shoulders, it felt like I was borrowing one last embrace. Grief became familiar, almost like an old companion. It no longer knocked me to the ground every morning, but it quietly followed me wherever I went. I learned to function with it. I learned to smile while carrying it. Most people thought I had completely healed, but the truth was simpler than that. I had just become very good at hiding the weight I carried. The support group slowly became more than a place where people talked about loss. It became a place where strangers reminded each other that surviving was something to be proud of. Every Thursday evening, we gathered in the same modest community center, drinking terrible coffee and sharing pieces of ourselves that we rarely showed anyone else. That was where I first met Daniel Brooks. Unlike everyone else, Daniel rarely spoke during the meetings. He listened carefully, nodded when others shared painful memories, and only offered a few thoughtful words before quietly slipping out the door. It wasn't until several weeks later that I learned he had lost his younger sister in a car accident years earlier. He wasn't there because he couldn't move on. He was there because he wanted to help other people carry their pain. There was something calming about him. He never tried to fix anyone. He never offered empty promises that everything would magically get better. Instead, he simply stayed present, and sometimes that was exactly what people needed. One rainy evening after a meeting, I discovered my car wouldn't start. I remember sitting behind the steering wheel, exhausted and close to tears, when someone gently knocked on my window. Daniel stood outside holding an umbrella while the rain soaked the shoulders of his jacket. He smiled the same quiet smile I had seen every Thursday for months and asked if I would allow him to take a look. Within 20 minutes, he had arranged for a mechanic he trusted to tow my car, then insisted on driving me home despite my repeated attempts to decline. During the drive, neither of us tried to impress the other. We spoke about ordinary things. He told me he worked as an architect restoring historic buildings throughout North Carolina. I admitted that I had forgotten what it felt like to enjoy a simple conversation without feeling guilty for laughing. Before I got out of his truck, he said something that stayed with me for days. He told me that people often believe healing means forgetting, when in reality, healing is learning to remember without falling apart. I smiled all the way to my front door, because for the first time in years, someone had understood exactly what I had been unable to explain. Friendship came naturally after that. There were no dramatic declarations or unexpected kisses. We met for coffee after support group meetings. We took long walks through local parks, where autumn leaves covered the walking paths in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes we sat on benches overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains without saying much at all. The silence between us felt peaceful instead of uncomfortable. Daniel never asked me to stop talking about Ethan. If I mentioned an old memory, he listened with genuine respect instead of changing the subject. I think that was the moment my heart began trusting him. He understood that loving me meant accepting every chapter that had shaped me, including the ones that came before him. Months passed before either of us acknowledged that our friendship had quietly become something deeper. Even then, we moved carefully, almost as though we were afraid of frightening happiness away. The first time Daniel reached for my hand, he paused long enough to let me pull away if I wanted. Instead, I intertwined my fingers with his and felt an overwhelming wave of emotion rush through me. It wasn't because I had stopped loving Ethan. It was because I realized my heart had survived something I once believed would destroy it forever. That evening, after Daniel walked me to my front porch, I sat alone for nearly an hour staring at the stars. I whispered Ethan's name into the quiet night and cried harder than I had cried in years. Not because I regretted falling in love again, but because I desperately wished life hadn't forced me to choose between holding on to the past and embracing the future. Somewhere deep inside, I hoped Ethan would understand. I hoped that if he could somehow see me, he would know I had fought as hard as I could before allowing myself to smile again. When Daniel finally asked me to marry him, it wasn't during an expensive vacation or a crowded restaurant. He proposed exactly where our friendship had begun, outside the community center after one of the Thursday meetings. Snowflakes drifted gently through the evening air, settling across the sidewalks like tiny stars. He reached into his coat pocket and held out a small velvet box with hands that trembled almost as much as mine. Before opening it, he looked directly into my eyes and said something I will never forget. He said, "Claire, I know I'll never replace Ethan, and I would never ask to. Your love for him helped make you the woman I admire today. I'm simply asking if you'll let me spend the rest of my life loving every part of who you are." There was no jealousy in his voice, no insecurity, only honesty. I burst into tears before I even saw the ring. When I finally whispered yes, it felt less like closing a door and more like opening a window after years of living in darkness. Planning our wedding brought excitement back into my life, in ways I hadn't expected. My mother cried while helping me choose another dress, insisting that happiness looked beautiful on me again. My best friend Olivia spent countless weekends helping decorate invitations and tasting cakes, laughing whenever I became overwhelmed by tiny details. Even Megan, Ethan's sister, hugged me tightly after I nervously told her about the engagement. I had dreaded that conversation for weeks, fearing she might believe I was abandoning her brother's memory. Instead, she smiled through tears and told me something that lifted an invisible burden from my shoulders. She reminded me that Ethan loved me too deeply to ever want me trapped inside loneliness. She kissed my forehead and promised she would be sitting in the front row cheering for me on my wedding day. Driving home that evening, I cried because I finally felt free to hope without apologizing for it. As the wedding drew closer, life became wonderfully ordinary again. Daniel and I argued playfully over paint colors for the house we planned to buy together. We joked about adopting another rescue dog because neither of us could resist animals with sad eyes. We spent evenings assembling furniture for the spare bedroom that we secretly hoped would someday become a nursery. It wasn't a perfect life, but it felt peaceful, steady, and full of quiet dreams. For the first time in years, I stopped measuring time by what I had lost and started measuring it by everything still waiting ahead of me. Then strange things began happening. It started with anonymous phone calls that ended the moment I answered. At first, I dismissed them as wrong numbers. Then I noticed an unfamiliar pickup truck parked across the street from my house several mornings in a row. Every time I looked directly toward it, the driver pulled away before I could make out a face. One afternoon, while organizing old documents in the attic, I found a small cardboard box containing letters Ethan had mailed to me during his overseas assignment. As I reread them, one envelope slipped from the stack. It wasn't addressed to me. It contained only a folded piece of paper with a handwritten sentence that immediately sent a chill through my body. If anything happens, don't stop looking for the truth. There was no signature, no explanation. I stared at those words for several minutes, trying to remember whether I had ever seen the note before. I couldn't. I convinced myself it had somehow become mixed with Ethan's belongings after the memorial. Still, something about it refused to leave my thoughts. 3 days before my wedding, I finally tucked the mysterious note back into the box and told myself I was allowing old grief to play tricks on my mind. Daniel was coming over that evening so we could finalize the seating chart, and I refused to let strange coincidences steal my happiness. The morning sunlight poured through my kitchen windows as I arranged fresh flowers in a vase and quietly imagined what my life would look like 1 week later. Then, just after noon, there was a knock at my front door. At first, I almost ignored it. I wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again. Slower this time, heavier, almost hesitant. I walked toward the door with the vase still in my hands, smiling because I assumed Daniel had arrived early. I unlocked the deadbolt, turned the handle, opened the door. The vase slipped from my fingers and shattered across the porch. Because standing in front of me was the man I had buried 5 years earlier. I wish I could tell you that I screamed, ran into Ethan's arms, or collapsed onto the porch in disbelief. The truth is much stranger than that. I didn't move at all. My mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. Every instinct told me this had to be a cruel dream, the kind that feels real until you wake up gasping for air. I blinked over and over, hoping the man standing in front of me would disappear. But he didn't. He stood there with his hands hanging at his sides as though he wasn't sure he even deserved to knock on my door. His clothes were worn from travel. His beard had more gray than I remembered. A thin scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and there were deep lines around his eyes that had never existed before. 5 years had changed him, but they had not erased him. Those eyes, they were still Ethan's. They held the same kindness that had made me fall in love with him, except now that kindness was buried beneath unimaginable exhaustion. Neither of us spoke. The only sound came from the broken glass scattered across my porch, and the distant wind rustling through the trees. Finally, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he whispered my name, Claire. The moment he said it, every wall I had built around my heart began to crack. I wanted answers, but they wouldn't come out as questions. Instead, I heard myself asking something so simple that it surprised even me. Are you real? Ethan lowered his head, and I watched tears fall onto the porch between us. He nodded once. I am. I reached toward his face with trembling fingers, stopping just inches away, because I was terrified my hand would pass straight through him. When I finally touched his cheek, it was warm, solid, human. My knees gave out beneath me, and before I hit the ground, Ethan caught me exactly the way he used to whenever I tripped over absolutely nothing. That familiar instinct broke something inside me. I pulled away almost immediately, staring at him with a mixture of relief, anger, confusion, and disbelief. You can't be here, I whispered. I buried you. He closed his eyes for a moment before answering. I know. Those 2 words carried more pain than any explanation ever could. I invited him inside because I couldn't continue standing in front of the neighbors while my entire world was falling apart. We sat across from each other in the living room that had once belonged to both of us. Nothing felt familiar anymore. The house suddenly seemed too small for everything waiting to be said. Ethan looked around slowly, noticing the framed photographs, the new furniture, the fresh paint on the walls. His eyes eventually landed on the engagement photo of Daniel and me sitting on the fireplace mantel. He didn't ask about it. He simply nodded to himself as though he had expected to see something like that. The silence between us stretched so long that I finally broke it. Start from the beginning, I said. And don't leave anything out. Ethan took a slow breath before folding his hands together. They were rougher than I remembered, marked by countless scars that hadn't existed when he left. He looked like a man who had survived more than anyone should ever have to. The collapse happened exactly the way they told you, he began. The building came down without warning. I was trapped beneath part of the structure with 3 other workers. We managed to survive the first night, but flooding cut off every route the rescue teams had been using. After 2 days, another collapse separated me from everyone else. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. When I finally escaped, I wasn't rescued by emergency workers. I was found by an armed militia that controlled the region outside the disaster zone. I felt my stomach tighten. Ethan explained that the country had quietly descended into political violence during the weeks leading up to the disaster. Foreign aid workers became valuable bargaining tools. He and several others were taken deep into isolated territory where they were held as leverage against international organizations. News of their survival never reached the outside world because the group responsible wanted governments to believe they had all died during the collapse. Dead men were easier to forget than living hostages. I stared at him without interrupting. Part of me desperately wanted to reject every word, but another part could see the truth written across his face. Ethan wasn't telling the story of a hero. He was reliving a nightmare. He explained that the captives were moved constantly to avoid detection. Communication with the outside world was impossible. Anyone caught attempting to escape faced severe punishment, and after watching 2 men disappear following failed escape attempts, Ethan realized survival depended on patience rather than courage. "Every day," he said softly, "I repeated your name in my head because I was terrified that if I stopped saying it, I'd forget what home felt like." Tears blurred my vision. 5 years earlier, I had whispered his name into an empty casket. During those same years, he had been whispering mine from somewhere I never knew existed. "But they recovered your passport," I interrupted. "Your ring, your identification." Ethan nodded. The flood scattered personal belongings everywhere. Some of my things were found near workers who didn't survive. Once the reports were filed, nobody had any reason to question them. As far as the world was concerned, Ethan Walker died in that collapse. He leaned back against the chair and looked toward the ceiling. "I didn't know you believed I was dead until much later. I assumed you were searching for me. I held on to that hope every single day." My chest tightened so painfully I could barely breathe. We had both spent 5 years believing the other was living a completely different reality. Neither of us had chosen the silence that separated us. "What changed?" I finally asked. "How are you here now?" Ethan explained that nearly 6 months earlier, an international security operation finally reached the area where several captives were being held. The rescue itself was chaotic, and many of those freed required months of medical treatment before they could even begin rebuilding their identities. Government agencies worked to verify survivors whose records had long since been closed. By the time Ethan regained enough strength to travel, there were endless interviews, investigations, and legal procedures before he could return home. "The first thing I asked for was a phone," he admitted with a faint smile. "The first thing I searched was your name." His smile disappeared almost instantly. "That's when I saw your engagement announcement." The room became painfully quiet. "I almost didn't come," he confessed. "I told myself you'd already suffered enough because of me. I thought maybe I should disappear and let you have the life you had rebuilt." His eyes filled with tears. "But I couldn't spend the rest of my life knowing I never even told you I was alive. You deserved the truth, no matter what happened afterward." I looked down at my engagement ring. Just that morning it had represented my future. Now it felt impossibly heavy on my hand. I loved Daniel. There was no question about that. He had patiently helped me find happiness again without ever asking me to erase Ethan's memory. But now Ethan wasn't a memory anymore. He was sitting only a few feet away, breathing the same air, carrying 5 years of suffering that neither of us had chosen. "You should hate me," Ethan said quietly. I looked up immediately. "Why would I hate you?" "Because I wasn't here." His voice cracked on those final words. "I missed birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings. I wasn't there when you cried yourself to sleep. I wasn't there when you stood in front of an empty casket. I wasn't there when you needed me most." "You didn't choose that," I answered almost instinctively. "No," he replied, "but neither did you." That single sentence settled over us like a weight neither of us knew how to lift. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the living room floor as the hours slipped away. We talked until our voices became hoarse. We laughed through tears while remembering the grocery store where we met, the burnt pancakes Ethan insisted were still edible, the tiny apartment where we had dreamed about building a family. For a few fragile moments, it almost felt as though time had folded back on itself. Then my phone rang. Daniel. His name illuminated the screen between us. Neither of us moved. The ringing stopped. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Can't wait to see you tonight. Only 3 more days until I get to marry the love of my life. I stared at the words until they blurred. Across the room, Ethan quietly stood. I should go, he said. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to ask him 1,000 more questions. I wanted to rewind 5 years. Instead, I stood frozen as he walked toward the front door. Just before leaving, he turned back one last time. I didn't come here to take your future away, Claire, he said softly. I only came because I couldn't let you spend another day believing I never came home. The door closed behind him. I remained standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by 2 lives that somehow both belonged to me, and knowing that by the end of the week, one of them would have to become my past. The moment Ethan walked out of my house, I realized there are some choices that don't have right answers. There are only consequences. I stood in my living room staring at the front door long after he disappeared, trying to convince myself that if I stayed perfectly still, somehow the last 5 hours would undo themselves. The engagement ring on my finger suddenly felt unfamiliar, and every photograph around me seemed to belong to a different version of my life. 5 years ago, I had begged God for one miracle, that Ethan would come home. Now that miracle had arrived, and instead of bringing peace, it had left me standing between 2 men who had loved me with everything they had. I picked up my phone to call Daniel more than once, but every time my thumb hovered over his name, I froze. How do you tell the man who patiently helped rebuild your heart that your husband has walked back into your life? There is no gentle way to deliver a truth capable of breaking 3 hearts at once. Daniel arrived just before sunset carrying 2 paper bags filled with takeout from the little Italian restaurant we loved. The smell of fresh bread and garlic filled the kitchen, but neither of us would eat a single bite. The moment he looked at me, his smile disappeared. He had always been able to read my face before I spoke. He quietly placed the bags on the counter and walked toward me without asking questions. Claire, he said softly, what happened? I tried to answer, but my voice refused to cooperate. My hands trembled so violently that I finally sat down at the kitchen table. Daniel knelt beside me and gently held my hands, waiting with the same patience he had shown me from the very beginning. Finally, through tears I could no longer hold back, I whispered, Ethan came home. His fingers loosened around mine. He didn't pull away. He didn't stand up. He simply stared at me, searching my face for some sign that this was grief speaking instead of reality. He's alive, I said again. He's really alive. For several long seconds, the room became completely still. Then Daniel asked the question I least expected. Are you sure? There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just quiet disbelief. I nodded. I touched him. I talked to him. He told me everything. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. I watched him take one long breath before opening them again. Tell me from the beginning. So I did. I told him about the knock at the door. I told him about Ethan's scars, his tears, and the years he had spent trapped in a nightmare while the world believed he was gone. I explained the rescue, the investigations, and how he had only recently discovered that I had mourned him, instead of searching for him. Daniel listened without interrupting once. When I finally finished, he looked toward the engagement photograph sitting on the fireplace mantel. He smiled sadly before speaking. When I asked you to marry me, I knew your heart had belonged to someone before it ever belonged to me. I accepted that because I loved all of you. I just never imagined I would meet the man I thanked in my prayers for teaching you how to love. His words broke something inside me. I'm so sorry, I whispered. Daniel immediately shook his head. No, Claire, don't apologize for surviving. Hearing those words from him felt almost impossible, because they echoed the same compassion Ethan had shown only hours earlier. Daniel stood and walked to the window, watching the fading sunlight settle across the yard. After several quiet moments, he turned back toward me. I need you to answer one question honestly. I nodded through tears. If Ethan had come home 6 months ago, before we met, what would you have done? The answer came before I even had time to think. I would have run into his arms. Daniel lowered his head and smiled sadly. That's what I thought. I immediately reached for him, but that's not today. Everything is different now. You've become part of my life. I love you. He looked at me with eyes full of both heartbreak and understanding. I know you do. That's what makes this so difficult. That evening we sat together for hours without touching the food he had brought. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with memories, questions, and fears neither of us knew how to express. Finally, Daniel looked at me and quietly said, You need to see him again. I stared at him in disbelief. What? You heard me. Daniel, I can't ask you to go through this. He offered a tired smile. You're not asking. I'm choosing. I began shaking my head. I'm terrified that whatever I decide will destroy someone. Daniel gently squeezed my hand. Claire, the decision isn't about who deserves you more. It's about where your heart truly belongs now. Not 5 years ago, now. The next morning, Daniel drove me to the small hotel where Ethan was staying. The drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains felt strangely peaceful despite the storm inside my heart. Neither of us spoke very much. Every mile seemed to carry us closer to a conversation none of us wanted but all of us needed. When we arrived, Daniel parked the truck overlooking the hotel entrance. Before I stepped out, he reached across the center console and held my hand one last time. No matter what happens today, he said quietly, I will never regret loving you. I couldn't answer because every word dissolved into tears. I simply nodded before walking inside. I found Ethan sitting alone on the outdoor terrace overlooking the mountains. He stood immediately when he saw me, relief washing across his face until he noticed Daniel walking several steps behind me. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply looked at one another, both fully aware that they were standing face to face with the man who represented the other half of my heart. Finally, Daniel extended his hand. Ethan accepted it. Daniel. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it carried more respect than I ever imagined possible. We sat together beneath the afternoon sky, and for nearly 3 hours, no one raised their voice. There were no accusations, no resentment, no attempts to claim ownership over my future. Instead, there was honesty. Ethan apologized repeatedly, not for surviving, but for the pain his absence had caused. Daniel listened carefully before quietly saying, I can't hate a man who spent 5 years fighting just to come home. Ethan lowered his eyes. I never came here expecting Claire to choose me. Daniel looked at him thoughtfully. Then why did you come? Ethan answered without hesitation. Because she deserved to know I kept my promise. I never stopped trying to come home. Later, Daniel excused himself, saying he wanted to grab coffee from the lobby downstairs. I knew he was giving Ethan and me a chance to speak alone. The moment he disappeared through the hotel doors, the silence between Ethan and me returned. We both watched the mountains for a while before either of us spoke. I imagined this moment every single day, Ethan admitted quietly. I thought if I survived, if I could just make it back to you, everything would somehow go back to the way it was. He laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. I even imagined what you'd say when you opened the door. What did you imagine? I asked. That you'd yell at me for taking so long. I smiled through tears. I probably would have. We both laughed for the first time since his return. Then Ethan looked at me with heartbreaking honesty. But that's not the woman standing in front of me anymore. I felt my chest tighten. And I'm not the same man you married. Neither of us argued with that truth. He looked out toward the mountains again. I've spent 5 years surviving, he said. You've spent 5 years rebuilding. Somewhere along the way, life kept moving for both of us. I wiped away another tear. I waited for you until I truly believed you were gone. I know. I didn't replace you, Ethan. I know. I survived you. His eyes filled with tears, but instead of looking away, he smiled. I'm proud of you. Those words hit me harder than anything else he had said. I always worried, I confessed, that moving forward meant I was leaving you behind. He immediately shook his head. No. His voice was steady. You carried me with you. That's why you're still standing. I couldn't stop crying. After a long silence, Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed my old wedding ring, the one he had worn every single day. I never took it off, he whispered. He placed it gently in my palm. I think it's time I stopped asking yesterday to become tomorrow. I stared at the ring resting beside my engagement ring. One represented the life I had lost. The other represented the life waiting ahead. Just then Daniel returned, carrying 3 cups of coffee. He looked at us and immediately knew we had said things neither of us could have spoken in front of him. He quietly handed each of us a cup before sitting down again. The 3 of us remained there as the afternoon slowly faded into evening. No one was trying to win. No one was trying to prove they loved me more. For the first time since Ethan came home, I realized something that completely changed the way I looked at both men. Love wasn't asking them to fight for me. Love was asking each of them to set me free. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, Daniel slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed the small velvet ring box from the day he proposed. He turned it over in his hands before placing it gently in front of me. Then he looked into my eyes with a tenderness I will never forget. Claire, his voice was calm, even though I could see tears forming. If you choose Ethan because your heart still belongs with him, I will spend the rest of my life missing you." He paused. "But I'll survive it." My heart broke all over again. "If you choose me because you feel guilty for what happened to him." He shook his head. "Then I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I stole someone else's future." He gently pushed the ring box toward me. "I love you too much to let guilt decide your future." Neither Ethan nor I spoke. Daniel smiled through his tears. "So don't choose the man who suffered the most." He looked at Ethan, then back at me. "Don't choose the man who stayed." Finally, he placed his hand over mine. "Choose the place where your heart finally feels at home." In that moment, I realized I wasn't looking at two men competing for my love. I was looking at two extraordinary men who loved me enough to risk losing me forever. When Daniel finished speaking, none of us moved. The evening breeze drifted across the terrace, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains below, but the silence between us was louder than anything I had ever heard. I looked down at my hands. Resting in one palm was my old wedding ring, the ring Ethan had carried through 5 years of captivity, because it reminded him that someone was waiting for him somewhere in the world. Resting in the other was the engagement ring Daniel had slipped onto my finger during a snowy evening outside the community center, where my life had quietly begun again. For several moments I simply stared at them. One represented a promise interrupted, the other represented a promise patiently built. Neither one was a mistake, neither one was a lie. They were both chapters of the same life. I looked at Ethan first, then at Daniel. Finally, I whispered the only words I could find. "I need time." Neither man looked disappointed. Neither man argued. Instead, they both nodded. For the first time since Ethan had returned, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days. I could breathe. The wedding scheduled for 3 days later was postponed that very evening, not because I had chosen Ethan, not because I had chosen Daniel, because I refused to make the biggest decision of my life while my heart was still trying to understand a miracle. Friends and family were shocked when they received the calls. Some assumed Daniel and I had broken up. Others thought cold feet had finally caught up with us. Only the people closest to us knew the truth. My mother cried the moment she opened the front door and saw Ethan standing beside me. She hugged him as though she had been given back a son she had already buried. Ethan's sister Megan completely froze when she saw him. She stood there covering her mouth before running across the room and throwing her arms around her brother. I don't think there was a dry eye in the house that afternoon. Watching that reunion reminded me that I wasn't the only person who had lost him. An entire family had spent 5 years learning how to live with an impossible absence. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever imagined. Ethan began intensive medical treatment and counseling. Years of captivity had left wounds that could not be seen from the outside. Some nights he couldn't sleep because every unfamiliar sound startled him awake. Crowded places overwhelmed him. Loud noises made him instinctively search for danger. There were days when simply walking through a grocery store exhausted him, because freedom itself had become something he needed to relearn. I visited often, but not as his wife trying to reclaim the past. I visited as someone who deeply loved him and wanted to see him heal. Daniel gave me space. Not once did he call asking when I would decide. Not once did he pressure me. He simply said, "When you're ready, you'll know." His patience somehow made me love him even more. Nearly 4 months passed. One crisp autumn afternoon, Ethan called and asked if I would meet him at a quiet overlook just outside Asheville. It happened to be the same place where, years earlier, we had talked for hours about buying a farmhouse someday. When I arrived, he was already sitting on a weathered wooden bench, watching the leaves dance across the hillsides. I sat beside him. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan smiled. "Do you remember the first promise I ever made you?" I laughed softly. "You promised you'd never let me eat another burnt pancake." He chuckled. "I kept that promise. You absolutely did." Then his smile slowly faded. My second promise, he looked toward the horizon, was that I'd always come home. I reached over and gently took his hand. "You did. It just took me longer than either of us imagined." We both smiled through tears. After another long silence, Ethan turned toward me. "Claire," his voice was calm. "I've had 4 months to think. I already knew what he was going to say. I came home believing I had lost 5 years." He shook his head. "I was wrong." He looked directly into my eyes. "I lost the life we were supposed to have." Fresh tears filled my eyes. "But that doesn't mean I have to take away the life you've built." I immediately shook my head. "You aren't taking anything away." He smiled gently. "I know. He reached into his pocket and handed me a folded photograph. It was old and slightly faded, a picture from our wedding day. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "Love should never become a prison." "I wrote that during my second year in captivity," he explained. "I kept thinking," he swallowed hard, "if Claire somehow believes I'm gone, I hope she keeps living." I couldn't stop crying, he continued. "So don't choose me because I survived." He squeezed my hand. "And don't choose Daniel because he waited." His eyes filled with quiet peace. "Choose the place where your heart finally feels at home." Those words sounded almost identical to what Daniel had said on the hotel terrace. At that moment, I realized something extraordinary. Neither man wanted to be chosen out of obligation. Both wanted to be chosen freely. That evening I drove home knowing the answer that had quietly been growing inside me for months. The next morning I went to Daniel's house. His truck sat in the driveway. Through the living room window, I saw him packing away the wedding decorations we had bought together. The unopened guest book rested inside a cardboard box. The suit he had planned to wear hung neatly inside a garment bag. He looked tired, older somehow. For several moments I simply stood outside watching him. Then I heard him whisper something to himself. "Thank you for loving me while you could." Those words shattered my heart. I knocked softly. Daniel opened the door. For a second neither of us spoke. He smiled politely, the kind of smile people wear when they're preparing themselves to lose something they love. "I figured you'd come today," he said quietly. I nodded. "I didn't want to interrupt while you were packing." He glanced toward the boxes behind him. I thought it might make things easier. I stepped inside. Without saying another word, I walked straight toward him. Then I wrapped my arms around him. He froze. Slowly, his arms wrapped around me too. "I've been looking for the right words," I whispered. "I don't need the right words." His voice was barely audible. "I just need the truth." I leaned back enough to look into his eyes. "The truth is," I smiled through tears, "I loved Ethan with every part of who I was." He nodded. "I know. And I'll always love him. I know. But somewhere along the way," I gently placed my hand against his face, "I fell in love with the man I became when I was with you." A tear rolled down Daniel's cheek. "I don't want yesterday back." I took his hands. "I want tomorrow." For several seconds, he simply stared at me. Then he laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because relief had finally reached a heart that had been carrying too much. He pulled me into another embrace. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Months later, Daniel asked me to dinner. Not to propose. Just dinner. There were no speeches. No audience. No surprises. Halfway through dessert, he smiled. "I think enough time has passed," I laughed. "I was hoping you'd say that." He reached across the table. "This time," he squeezed my hand, "I'm asking the woman you've become." He didn't even finish the question. "Yes," I answered. "This time, my answer doesn't come from grief. It came from peace." Our wedding took place the following spring beneath the soft blossoms of an apple orchard. The ceremony was small, simple, exactly the way we wanted. Just before the music began, I quietly walked away from the bridal suite and toward a familiar figure waiting beneath one of the trees. "Ethan." He smiled the moment he saw me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "Thank you," I whispered. He smiled. "For what?" "For loving me enough," my voice trembled, "to let me go." He held my shoulders and looked at me with the same warmth I had fallen in love with years earlier. Then he said something I'll carry with me forever. "You came home too, Claire." I cried harder than I had all year, not because I was losing him, but because I finally understood what he meant. Home was never a place. It wasn't even a person. Home was where my heart had finally found peace. During the ceremony, Ethan sat quietly in the front row beside Megan and my parents. When Daniel and I exchanged our vows, I glanced toward Ethan. He smiled, placed his hand over his heart, and nodded once. It felt like a blessing. Several years have passed since that unforgettable knock on my front door. Daniel and I eventually bought a farmhouse just outside Asheville. It has the wraparound porch Ethan and I once dreamed about. Every spring the apple trees burst into bloom, filling the air with the sweet fragrance of new beginnings. One tree stands slightly apart from the others. Beneath it rests a small wooden plaque. One afternoon our little daughter asked why that tree was different. I knelt beside her and brushed the dirt away from the weathered wood. It says, "For the ones we never stop loving." She looked at me with curious little eyes. "Who planted this tree, Mommy?" I smiled toward the porch, where Daniel was watching us with the same gentle smile that had first brought light back into my life. "A very good man," I answered. "He taught me that real love doesn't hold people back. It helps them find their way home." My name is Claire Walker, and when my husband came home after 5 years, I thought life was asking me to choose between two extraordinary men. Instead, it taught me that love isn't measured by who we keep. It's measured by the grace we show when life changes every plan we ever made. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let love become gratitude instead of possession. And sometimes, coming home has nothing to do with the front door you walk through. It has everything to do with the peace you finally find inside your heart. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Claire's place? Would you have chosen the husband who finally came home, or the man who helped you heal? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe that love, forgiveness, and second chances deserve to be celebrated, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable story. Share this video with someone who believes that the strongest hearts are the ones that keep loving, even after life breaks them. Until next time, take care of yourself, keep believing in hope, and remember, sometimes the greatest miracles arrive long after we've stopped expecting them.